What is a conscience? When we use the word conscience, we point toward three distinct but related experiences. Conscience is a capacity. It names people's ability to think about and make moral decisions. But there's more to it than that. When we make these choices, we're also choosing which values we will allow to guide us in life. Actions speak louder than words. So our conscience reflects the values we will actually live by, while what we say we value is often more of an aspiration, how we hope to live. Over time, these choices shape our habits. Conscience also then shapes the kind of people we will become. Conscience is also a process. People can make decisions impulsively or with a great deal of consideration. When our typical courses of action do not seem to guide us in a situation, we find ourselves needing to stop and think things through. Conscience guides us as we gather information, seek others' advice, and consider our options. Lastly, conscience is a decision. Our conscience does not express preferences as much as it forges commitments. Decisions of conscience are not mundane choices, like what we want to eat for dinner or what we want to watch on television. Conscience speaks more to our identity, our sense of what we stand for. When we act against a decision of conscience, it undermines our sense of integrity. The next section of this lecture summarizes what the Second Vatican Council teaches about conscience. In Catholic tradition, a council is a gathering of the world's bishops. It gives direction to the Church. Within the Catholic Church, a council has the highest teaching authority. The most recent council took place from 1962 to 1965 in 4 sessions, each held for about 8 weeks in the fall. When Pope John XXIII convened the council, he used an Italian word to describe their work, aggiornamento. In English, this means bringing up to date. The goal of the council was to bring Catholic practice up to date. The council wrote and published 16 statements that give guidelines to the faithful on how to practice their faith and direction to Catholic institutions. Among these statements, 4 of them discuss the topic of conscience. The Council calls the conscience a sanctuary, saying, "Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a human being. There, a person is alone with God, whose voice echoes in the depths of the person." In medieval European culture, a sanctuary is a privileged place. Civil authorities would not interfere with people when they were under the sanctuary of the Church, even if authorities suspected they had committed a crime. The civil authorities respected the primacy of a person's relationship with God. The Second Vatican Council teaches that all people are called to search for the truth, and that God reaches out to each person in turn. By respecting a person's conscience, we respect the primacy of a person's relationship with God, like the civil authorities of medieval Europe. This kind of freedom is what human dignity calls for. In addition, it's what a relationship with God requires. God does not coerce people, but seeks to build a relationship which, like friendship, people choose freely. Finally, people can only find an assent to truth in a climate of freedom. While all people have a responsibility to respect the primacy of conscience, governments and religious ministers have special responsibilities. Reverend Max Warren, an Anglican cleric and missionary, speaks well to a religious minister's duty to respect conscience by saying, "Our first task in approaching another people another culture, another religion, is to take off our shoes. For the place we are approaching is holy, else we may find ourselves treading on people's dreams. More seriously still, we may forget that God was here before our arrival. The Second Vatican Council speaks most clearly about government responsibilities to conscience when addressing the freedom of religion. Government support for religion fits within the government's responsibilities to protect the common welfare. It would be inappropriate for government authorities to command or restrict religious practice, or, by analogy, to restrict other activities inspired by conscience, provided they do not threaten the public order. Catholic moral theology on the subject of conscience presents some conundrums. A conundrum is a confusing problem that is difficult to resolve. For example, when we take this section of the Council's document on the Church in the Modern World, also known as Gaudium et Spes, and focus on these statements, they invite questions. The Council teaches that people will be judged according to their conscience. It also teaches that conscience errs frequently from invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance is an unfamiliar term. When people do not have a correct understanding of right and wrong, they are ignorant. If after study, reflection, and a sincere effort to understand what is right or wrong, a person persists in a wrong understanding, this ignorance is called invincible. People often ask whether this means people who have committed crimes against humanity with sincere conviction are now in heaven. And of course, nobody can answer this question with certainty because none of us have ever been there. People also ask how they can know when their conscience is in error, whether they have cared too little about truth and goodness, and how they can know when they have been blinded by habitual sin. These questions can also be difficult to answer. But if it is hard for us to answer these questions about ourselves, it does indicate that it is not a good idea to judge another person's conscience. And if we take this passage from the same council document, The Church in the Modern World, we find these statements. When we resequence them, they highlight some other questions that we cannot easily answer. People influence each other, so society and its members become more moral or less moral together. Freedom is necessary for conscience and is a requirement of justice. But when people take freedom too far, it can degrade respect for what is right and wrong. So what's happening for us today? Is society becoming more just, more moral, or is our shared morality declining? John Kavanaugh quotes the 19th century cultural critic John Ruskin. Follow your conscience, but make sure it is not the conscience of an ass. This quote suggests a response to the conundrums of conscience more than a solution to them. We should be attentive to the formation of our consciences. To form our consciences, we need to remember that all of creation is on a journey to perfection. We can all develop our moral character. To do this, we need the right influences. If we want to know what kind of people we are becoming, we can start first by looking at our friends. If we do not like what we see, it may be time to meet some new people. In addition, we need to pay attention to our culture's values because we are also influenced by our cultures. St. Ignatius offers a couple of suggestions that can help here. First, he speaks of the spiritual freedom he calls indifference. When we trust God, we can take a step back from our initial biases and look at things in a new way. If we experience an unfreedom, Ignatius suggests that we may need to agere contra. That's the Latin phrase to go against. It means to go against our initial inclinations. Because of the ideological polarization in our country today, a number of people find unfreedom when forming their consciences. They presume that everything said by people who disagree with them is wrong-headed, and they presume that the people who agree with them are always right. But it's hard to believe that the people who agree with us have attained perfection, or that we ourselves are perfect. If we feel strong enough in our convictions that we find ourselves discrediting people or discounting their values, there's a chance then that we have become closed off. We're experiencing unfreedom in the formation of our conscience. Ignatius' counsel encourages us to rethink our initial responses to choices and issues. This does not mean we abandon justice or cast off our primary commitments, but it does invite us to consider the justice of other people's positions. To form our consciences, we need to listen to our heart. Sculptor Frederick Frank explores the theme of conscience in many of his works. He reminds people that we live in relationship with others, and he depicts our heart or our conscience as the place where these relationships guide and inspire us. In this image, we see a person whose heart is filled with the faces of dozens of people. Frank's depiction of a person as relational at heart are consonant with an understanding of conscience developed by theologian Joseph Fuchs. In scientific disciplines, the natural sciences and social sciences, we form an understanding of the world by looking at the world outside of us. We act almost as though the world is an object distinct and separate from the observer. In contrast, our conscience calls us to look within, to find in our heart an understanding of our connections with others and of how we need to honor other people in our relationships. In addition to opening our hearts to the responsibilities of our relationships with others, conscience formation requires we understand the context within which we act by listening and learning. Theologians and educators have described the steps for conscience formation in a number of ways. The most prominent and long-lasting of these is the three-step process of see, judge, act. In the see step, we work to develop a clear understanding of our context. In the judge step, we do two things. We use human disciplines, including the sciences, to sharpen our perceptions of the world, and we use theological and moral reflection to inform our response. Finally, in the act step, we follow through on the decisions of conscience. We repeat this process so we can reflect on how well our actions worked out and to develop over the course of time a more complete understanding of how best to respond to the challenges our communities encounter. Catholic tradition has official teachings on moral issues. These teachings are primarily associated with the work of bishops in the Catholic Church, who have a responsibility to proclaim the gospel and guide Christian education. Bishops offer official church teaching to guide the faithful on how to follow Jesus today. Catholics believe the Holy Spirit guides the church today. Because of this, church teaching says the faithful can trust the church's guidance on morality as a reliable guide for conscience. Yet the bishops are not oracles. When we read their statements, we are not receiving messages handed down from heaven, independent of human understanding. Instead, the bishops offer an official theology, an official statement of faith-seeking understanding. The Catholic faithful are taught to approach the teachings of the Church with docility, which means being willing to be taught, while remaining open to growth. At the same time, church teaching honors the primacy of conscience. When people sincerely disagree with the guidance offered by the church on an issue, and after prayer and reflection, their conscience does not assent to church teaching, Catholics are taught to follow their conscience. In summary, the word conscience names our ability to make a moral decision, the process by which we form our conscience on an issue, and the experience of acting in conscience. The Second Vatican Council calls conscience our sanctuary. This image reminds us to honor the freedom of a person, to seek the truth, and to live in relationship with God as guided by conscience. Conscience leaves us with some conundrums. We realize that conscience errs frequently, and yet we are encouraged to follow our conscience and honor others' efforts to do the same. So, as we hold to the guidance of conscience, which remains always imperfect, we realize that we should always work to form our conscience, to love goodness, and to strive to do the right thing. Church teaching is a reliable guide for Catholics, and primacy of conscience means that Catholics who do not assent to church teaching on moral issues, like all people, should always follow their conscience.